I had a private conversation recently where I used the language tyrant to refer to some decisions of our federal government. And the person that I was talking to said, Pastor, that's a little overkill. I mean, tyranny, tyrant, and aren't those words a little strong for what we live with in our culture? And so I thought about that and wondered if maybe I'm using the wrong language. And so I decided to see if I could define what a tyrant looks like. I think I've done it, and I think we need to consider this biblically. The definition of a tyrant, I think, has a number of elements, but at least three that are relevant to where we are in our culture today. First of all, I would define a tyrant as somebody who practices intentional misinformation for his own advantage. Secondly, we're going to talk about these in just a minute, but secondly, I think a tyrant is someone who tries to intentionally subvert the objectivity of the law. In other words, the law doesn't mean what it means, and it doesn't apply across the board equally. In fact, that leads to the third point. I think that a tyrant actually weaponizes law against his opponents. In other words, you can put it this way. If you ask a tyrant a question, his first answer will be, well, that's not true. Well, once you show him that it is true, his second answer is, well, even if it is true, it doesn't matter. And when you say, well, yes, it matters to millions of citizens, his third response is, well, yes, it's true and it matters, but you're the guilty one here. You see, it moves from misinformation for the tyrant's advantage to the denial of objective realities in the law to the weaponization of the law against opponents. It's not true. Even if it is true, it doesn't matter. And even if it is true and it matters, you're the guilty party and it's all your fault. I think this is precisely where we live in our current culture. Let me share some stories with you. The Department of Justice, in court findings recently, has instigated an ongoing criminal investigation and prosecution against Hunter Biden, the son of the President of the United States. They're basing their charges on the contents of a laptop that he mistakenly abandoned in a repair shop somewhere in Delaware, and that laptop has tangible and provable evidence of corruption going literally to the highest levels of our government. Now, the problem is the Department of Justice and the FBI had that laptop for more than a year before the last presidential election. And yet, in that presidential election, when the compromising information related to Hunter Biden and his potential conflict of interest with his father, when that was brought up, Joe Biden, particularly in the debates with Donald Trump, assured us that all of that was untrue, that it was Russian disinformation. In fact, a letter miraculously appeared just weeks before the election, where 50 U.S. intelligence officials all signed a letter that had been composed by Anthony Blinken, who was the chairman of the Biden election campaign, who's now Secretary of State. He composed a letter, 50 intelligence officers signed it, suggesting that this laptop was not authentic, but that it was a plant by the Russians to influence the direction of our election. Of course, Biden himself knew when he said that in the debate, when he said this is not true, it's Russian information, I've got this letter from these 50 intelligence officials that have signed off on it, he knew when he said that he was lying to the American people. But you see, the first level of a nascent tyrant is, that's not true. I never said that. None of that's true. That's disinformation. You see, a tyrant changes the story so that he can gain an advantage even when the narrative goes against what he's trying to say. That's not true. Well, it turns out now that it was true. Because now the same Department of Justice that sat on that laptop so that we wouldn't know about it before the last election, the Department of Justice is now using that laptop as the foundational piece of its prosecution of Hunter Biden. So it turns out it wasn't the Russians interfering with our election, it was our own Department of Justice. Now, there's no way to know what would have happened in the election if the American people had had that information. We don't know. Things might have been exactly the same way. But it's interesting that we were told it's not true when the people who told us that knew for a fact it was true. First step towards tyranny. Well, the second step is the subversion of the objectivity of law. The Hawaii State Supreme Court made an interesting ruling this last couple of weeks. In a case entitled Hawaii versus Wilson, the state of Hawaii, the state Supreme Court, upheld certain state gun regulations, even though those gun regulations have clearly go against U.S. Supreme Court precedent in cases related to the Second Amendment of the Constitution. What's interesting about this is the justification. When the Hawaii Supreme Court said, we're going to uphold these gun restrictions, even though these exact restrictions have been rejected by the U.S. Supreme Court, they did it on the basis of what they call the aloha spirit. Now, if you say, well, is that a legal term? No, it's not a legal term. It's a stupid term. What they said was that Hawaii has the right to live by a different standard because they have the spirit of life on the islands that they referred to as the aloha spirit. In fact, they said the court can make judicial decisions by contemplating the life force that resides among us and give due consideration to the aloha spirit. In other words, they've just passed a law that they've just issued a ruling that says that Hawaii can reject U.S. Supreme Court rulings because there's a sort of mystical island presence that Hawaii has that allows them to live by different rules. Now, first of all, state courts cannot reject Supreme Court precedent on matters of federal law. When the Hawaii Supreme Court did this, they violated at least two constitutional mandates. First, the Supremacy Clause of Article 6 says that federal law, especially the Constitution, is the supreme law of the land. In other words, anytime a state law contradicts constitutional law, the Constitution wins. Secondly, the principles of federalism hold that the law at issue receives its definitive judicial interpretation from the government that made it. In other words, the U.S. government has a constitution with a Bill of Rights, the Second Amendment of which protects our constitutional right to bear arms. This provision argues that the state Supreme Court of Hawaii cannot then reinterpret the Constitution in contradictory ways. You see, what's happening is they've placed their state constitution above the U.S. Constitution. In other words, they've moved us towards the second step of tyranny, which is to make the objectivity of law subjective so that the law can't be trusted across the board, but different people get to play by different rules. In other words, well, that's not true. Well, it is true. Well, even if it is true, it doesn't matter. Well, here's the problem. We now live in a generation in America where we live in serious times, but these serious times are populated with stupid people. Well, the third part of this, it's not true. Well, yes, it is true. Well, even if it's true, it doesn't matter. Well, yes, it is true, and it does matter. The third level of tyranny is the weaponization of law against opponents. Yes, it's true, and you're the guilty party in the process. Here's where we see the weaponization of the law, and that is over the last few years, we have watched steadily as an apparent trend has emerged that I would call selective prosecution, otherwise known as the weaponization of the law. In this process, we have riots that result in the destruction of property, literal violence against law enforcement officers with a high degree of coordination, I might add, not popular uprisings that just break out, but coordinated riots in the streets of many major cities in America. And yet the people that are arrested for participating in those riots and for that destruction of property, the people, for example, in Seattle that hijack a police precinct building, that take it over and literally drive the police out, those people are all in jurisdictions where district attorneys refuse to press charges. No one gets convicted. No one goes to jail. In fact, if they do go to jail, it's just long enough to take a shower and get cleaned up, and then they're back out on the streets. Here's the problem. It's not a general rejection of law across the board, because what we've seen at the same time that there are certain approved crimes that are looked past and allowed to go unchallenged and unpunished, the same time that we've seen that trend, we see another trend, which is that certain crimes, the unacceptable crimes, are now being prosecuted with an enthusiasm that is mind-boggling. For example, the most acute discrimination in this weaponization of the law is saved for the most fearsome of all criminals in our land, pro-lifers. You see, the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act, or FACE as it's known by acronym, is a law that was passed during the Clinton administration, and it was designed to be a law to prevent the actual hindrance of access to abortion clinics. In fact, this is what the law says. The FACE Act prohibits violent, threatening, damaging, and obstructive conduct intended to injure, intimidate, or interfere with the right to seek, obtain, or provide reproductive health services. All right, let's look at those words. Interference refers to the restriction of bodily movement. In other words, physically restraining somebody from entering an abortion clinic would fall into this category. Intimidation is a word that is equated with the threat of bodily harm. That is, screaming physical violent threats at people who are trying to enter abortion clinics. That would fall under this category. Physical obstruction means rendering ingress or egress from a facility impassable. In other words, creating barriers that people couldn't get past to get in or out of clinics. All of those are actions that the law was originally designed to prevent. Well, what happens now is that FACE, this law, it carries by statute a sentence for the first offense of less than a year. But here's what the current government administration is doing. They are going to people standing the required distance away from abortion clinic entrances. They are not catcalling, they are not screaming threats, they are not physically intimidating or preventing entrance or exit. They are typically holding signs in silence and often praying or singing together. Get that, a sufficient distance, no hindrance of access, singing and praying. They're now being arrested almost across the country, and because the government is arguing that they are coordinating their protests, they have added federal conspiracy charges. So now a first offense under the FACE Act, which by statute is less than a year, now those arrested for praying a sufficient distance from an abortion clinic, they're being charged with up to 10 years in prison. This is the weaponization of the law. The law itself was not even designed for the kind of peaceful, quiet, non-threatening protest that we see, and yet it has been weaponized in the same way that we've seen parents at school board meetings who object to material that their children are being exposed to. The Attorney General has referred to them as domestic terrorists. Well, here's the thing. One congressman said this: Biden's Department of Justice has brazenly weaponized the FACE Act against normal, everyday Americans across the political spectrum simply because they are pro-life. What does the Bible say? Well, let me give you some passages that you can look up, but I'll just read a couple of them. Isaiah chapter 5, beginning in verse 20. This is what God says through the prophet. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who substitute darkness for light and light for darkness, who substitute bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and clever in their own sight. Isaiah chapter 10, beginning in verse 1, says this: Woe to those who enact unjust statutes and to those who constantly record harmful decisions, so as to deprive the needy of justice and rob the poor among my people of their rights, so that the widows may be their spoil, and that they may plunder the orphans. Now, what will you do in the day of punishment and in the devastation which will come from afar? Well, Isaiah chapter 13, verse 11. God says, So I will punish the world for its evil, and the wicked for their wrongdoing. I will also put an end to the audacity of the proud and humiliate the arrogance of the tyrants. How do we approach living in this generation? Well, Psalm 73 has to be a guideline for us. David the psalmist in Psalm 73 confessed that he had a serious problem. Let me read you this verse. In verse 1, he says, God certainly is good to Israel, to those who are pure in heart. But then he says this, But as for me, my feet came close to stumbling. My steps had almost slipped, for I was envious of the arrogant, and I saw the prosperity of the wicked. For there are no pains in their death, and their belly is fat. They are not in trouble like other people, nor are they tormented together with the rest of mankind. David said, I looked at the wicked, and it turns out they seem to have all the breaks. They seem to be prosperous and healthy and strong. The government is favorable to them. They get all the breaks. He said, my feet almost slipped because I thought maybe the world doesn't have God in charge of it. He goes on to describe the arrogance of those around him and how it really broke his spirit to look around and see how wicked men seem to be doing so well across the board. But then he says this in verse 15. He said, if I had said, I will speak this way, in other words, if I had testified that I believed this, behold, I would have betrayed the generation of your children. When I thought of understanding this, it was troublesome in my sight until I entered the sanctuary of God. Then I perceived their end. You indeed put them on slippery ground and dropped them into ruin. How they are destroyed in a moment. They are utterly swept away by sudden terrors. He said, listen, I almost lost my faith because I looked around and it seemed like the bad guys were winning everywhere I looked. But he said, then I came into the presence of God. And when I found the presence of God, when I began to see the world from His perspective, I began to understand that I wasn't looking far enough down the road. I was looking at this moment when they seem to have it easy, when everything seems to be in their favor. But he said, I looked further down the road, and what I realized is there's judgment coming. The leaders, the tyrants of this generation, they are racing at breakneck speed down a road that leads to a brick wall. And he said, I regained my faith because God is still in control, but the unfolding of His plan is in His timetable and not in mine. I say you should read Psalm 73, ponder it, because we need to come back and grasp the reality that while wickedness seems to be winning, it's not true. We need to come into the presence of God so that we can look at the culture around us and perceive its end. We need to see where things are headed, where they're going, and we need to stay firm on standing where God has called us to stand on truth. We do live in a generation that I believe is moving increasingly toward tyranny. I think these levels you will see more and more examples of. But the fact of the matter is, God is still in control, and He has a special place for those who stand on His side. So let's not lose sight of Him. Let's not lose faith by pondering the successes of the tyrants. Let's look at the end of that road, because at the end of the road, the only people left standing are the people of God. This is Truth Currents.